I've been asked how this is called Ukrainian World Nation because I am not from Ukraine. So let me introduce you to a new term that I came up with, and it's called Ukraine-splaining. And there are a lot of issues here in the US and other countries that directly affect Ukraine in profound ways. But I know that I don't keep up on what's going on with Germany's military or Australia. And so it's really, I hope you can appreciate that I would take out some of the important parts that are going on in the US that have that major effect and is not misleading or information or isn't a lie. This is straight from military sources. This one in particular is very important to me because a couple of months ago there was information coming out that Russia was really close to or had some kind of a weapon in space they were developing that would knock out satellites. And I think that people freaked out so much that the next day on Good Morning America, they honestly, this is real, had Neil deGrasse Tyson come on and try to reassure everyone that yes, it would be inconvenient, yes, it would knock stuff out, but it would not harm humans. So anyway, let's talk about that because some more information came up and I think it's incredibly cool to be aware. And then it's important for all of us to be informed so that we can keep informing our government representatives and encourage them to do the right thing. The first speaker is kind of a quiet speaker, and he talks pretty slow, so I'm going to speed him up for you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you're here on a Friday afternoon. Not that many people will do anything on a Friday afternoon that's serious, so it shows that you're all very serious people, and I thank you for coming. My name is John Hamry. I'm the president here at CSIS, and I want to say a hearty welcome to all of you. We're in for a very unique opportunity. Assistant Secretary Stewart is, this doesn't normally happen. When there's something that's kind of a breaking, very serious development, we don't normally have the opportunity to hear from a senior policymaker in the State Department or any place to share with us the thinking of the government about a big development. And this is a big development, and so we're really very fortunate. I don't know, it was a week ago, 10 days ago, Jake Sullivan, in a press availability, made note that we think Russia has put a nuclear device in orbit. Now, I mean, for 50 years, we've had what are called RTGs. These are power sources that are used to provide electricity for satellites. They've been nuclear, there's a nuclear core to those, but this is different, okay? This is an implication that there's now a weapon in orbit, or could be a weapon in orbit. And that's a very profound thing. First of all, it's a violation of international obligations. I mean, nuclear weapons in space are really profoundly different from nuclear weapons here on, planet Earth. I mean, we're used to thinking about blast effects, and there's the shock wave and all that sort of thing. All of that is the product of an earthly environment. But in space, a nuclear detonation has no environment, to transform the energy, and so it becomes X-rays that have astounding reach. And so it's a threat not to something that's 5 miles away, 10 miles away, it's a threat to things that are 100 miles away. And when we think of how space is becoming the ubiquitous platform for so many, both companies and countries and companies, this is a profound threat. It's really a serious issue. And so we're going to explore that today. And I just want to say thank you to you, Secretary Stewart, for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you here. I don't know that many, well, I know government employees are working on Friday afternoon. Not that many of us, civilians are working Friday afternoon. Clayton is working Friday afternoon. Clayton Swope is going to run this meeting. Let me turn it to you, Clayton. Let's get this started. Thank you so much for coming, Secretary.
Okay, essentially, she is answering a lot of questions, and those that are posing the questions come from reputable news sources. I did slow this back down because this guy is not a slow speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Hamry, for that introduction. Again, my name is Clayton Swope. I am the Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS.
I'm sorry about that. I didn't have the sound set up for a minute, so I'm going to go ahead and go back.
We are here today to discuss Russia's development of a nuclear anti-satellite weapon, which was one of the most concerning developments in our most recent report, released just 2 weeks ago. So we've heard a lot of speculation based on few confirmed details about what Russia may be working on since February's news. We know that the United States is working with allies and partners, particularly at the United Nations and through a recent UN Security Council resolution on this issue. So to start us off, Secretary Stewart, could you tell us more about what the United States assesses that Russia is developing, and how is the U.S. working to address this threat?
Thank you, Clayton, and thank you, Dr. Hamry. Really, really happy to be here today on this particular day before May 5th tomorrow, so even more special. The United States is extremely concerned that Russia may be considering the incorporation of nuclear weapons into its counter-space programs, based on information we deem credible. The United States has been aware of Russia's pursuit of this sort of capability dating back years. But only recently have we been able to make a more precise assessment of their progress. Russia has publicly claimed that their satellite is for scientific purposes. However, the orbit is in a region not used by any other spacecraft. That in itself was somewhat unusual. And the orbit is a region of higher radiation than normal lower Earth orbits, but not high enough of a radiation environment to allow accelerated testing of electronics, as Russia has described the purpose to be. I also want to take a moment to consolidate here what we have said previously, just to remind you. What we want to clarify is that this is not an active capability that has already been deployed. Although Russia's pursuit of this capability is deeply troubling, there's no imminent threat. We aren't talking about a weapon that can be used to attack humans or cause structural damage on Earth. Instead, as Assistant Secretary Plum said yesterday in his testimony, our analysts assess that a detonation in a particular placement in orbit of a magnitude and location would render lower Earth orbit unusable for a certain amount of time. Of course, the broader issue here is that placement by state parties to the Outer Space Treaty of a nuclear weapon in orbit is a clear violation of the Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. And this is something that we've been discussing, and we've been emphasizing, and we've been trying to raise awareness of. We also, as Clayton mentioned, pursued a UN Security Council resolution to this effect, to try to strengthen the Outer Space Treaty and to try to reinforce states parties' commitment to Article 4, particularly because of the extraordinary result and risk to vital communications, scientific capacity, meteorological capacities, agricultural, commercial, and of course national security capabilities that satellites in this orbit would support and would be immediately eradicated by such a violation and a use of such a weapon. So you asked what we're doing, and I'd be happy to talk about that. The president has directed a series of actions, specifically with such grave consequences to the international security and the long-term sustainability of the outer space environment. We decided to take this issue to the UN Security Council. There is no other forum right now in the international arena for implementation of the Outer Space Treaty. Right? It's different than some of the other arms control treaties in that there isn't a body set up specifically to implement.
In Ukraine's explain, this means that it was really vital that countries came together and went to the UN and had this resolution in regard to this issue. However, how effective is the UN right now? I mean, I think that they pretty much lost their legitimacy through this action that Russia has taken with the full-scale invasion. And Russia isn't willing to comply with the rules. So trying to make up other rules, I don't know if there's even a reason for that. So it's very concerning to me that she openly stated that there is no other forum that they have at their disposal to address this issue. So we only have the UN, who I think in some ways is not even legitimate right now.
Implement this particular treaty. And given the grave consequences of a potential violation, we thought that there should be a UN Security Council resolution reconfirming states parties' commitments to Article 4 and taking several other steps, and I can talk about that. So one is to consider a UN Security Council resolution. At the same time, to engage bilaterally with Russia, bilaterally with other countries, and as Secretary Blinken and I believe Jake Sullivan himself have mentioned, we did discuss this directly with China and with India, and we've been discussing this with other countries that have a vested interest, of course, in the sustainability of the outer space environment and at the UN. So going to our UN proposal, the US and Japan jointly proposed, and with ultimately 65 co-sponsors in total, a UN Security Council resolution that reconfirmed the importance of the Outer Space Treaty, that recommitted states parties to that treaty to abide by Article 4, prohibiting the prevention in orbit around the Earth of nuclear weapons or other WMD, that reaffirmed the importance of the peaceful uses and sustainable exploration and access to space, and encouraged those member states of the UN that weren't states parties to the Outer Space Treaty to consider joining and supporting this. But also importantly, that called upon states to not develop any nuclear weapons or WMD for placement in outer space. So that went a step beyond, but it was a request. It's calling upon countries to do this. The Outer Space Treaty is unique in that it prohibits the placement in orbit around the Earth of these weapons, but it doesn't talk about the development of the weapons as other arms control treaties do in certain circumstances. So we thought adding the effort to call upon states to not develop such weapons would be useful. We thought it was a very non-political, even-handed approach to remind the world and to reinforce the Outer Space Treaty and its commitments, and we took it forward, again, with a total of 65 co-sponsors to the UN Security Council. As you know, Russia vetoed it, and as was noted by our ambassador to the UN, this was inconsistent with Putin's statement that he intended not to place a nuclear weapon in outer space, and we found it raised questions, quite frankly, as to why he felt the need to veto this UN Security Council resolution, which also incorporated the idea of additional steps, points that, and I can talk about this in more detail if you want, points that both Russia and China made. The idea of taking additional steps through either legally binding mechanisms or non-legally binding to reinforce, to support, and to build upon the commitments in the Outer Space Treaty to prevent an arms race in outer space. Our UN Security Council resolution worked to support preventing an arms race in outer space through these mechanisms, especially where we can sort of develop essentially credible and reliable means to verify such additional steps. So we tried to accommodate the comments we heard from many, both on the UN Security Council and off, and we amended the resolution, doubling the number of preambular paragraphs and also adding significant substance to the operative paragraphs to reflect some of the good comments we heard. We engaged with both Russia and China numerous times. We tried to accommodate and incorporate those suggestions that we could agree to, but they, Russia in particular, really relied upon their effort to insist on additional parameters as they proposed in their amendment to the resolution that was not agreed to, and as they subsequently proposed in their UN Security Council resolution that followed.
As I said, you are welcome to click on the link below or cut and paste. I don't know if it will hyperlink, to be honest, but let me just kind of sum up some of the challenges that she talks about. First of all, the fact that Russia isn't complying with other UN standards. And so she said that they are questioning whether, what are the legal parameters of any kind of agreement that would prohibit nuclear proliferation in space and essentially create another Cold War, because we would be proliferating in space. It would be different, but we're still in a space race. So that's kind of different. And she said that Russia is wanting to amend those things, saying that it just says there can't be weapons in space, but they're not willing to define what weapons are. That is something that the countries in the UN have been debating for several years. Even if there was a ban on nuclear weapons in space, that does not necessarily prohibit nuclear weapons from ground to space. So those are some concerns that are being addressed right now, to sum up.
Fits within the context of Russia's behaviors on arms control in general, maybe disinformation from Russia on issues related to arms control. Do you think that there is a pattern with space-related activities or with this resolution that looks similarly to how they behave on broader arms control issues?
I mean, I think all of us have been tracking that the Russian Federation has walked away from numerous, if not all, of the existing arms control and non-proliferation architectures to a certain degree. Certainly, its illegal suspension of the New START Treaty in light of its ongoing illegal invasion of Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter reflects its desire to place its personal, ambition above international law. And I think we've also seen that in their withdrawal from the CFE. We've seen that in them sort of challenging international architectures such as the Chemical Weapons Convention in their repeated use of chemical weapons, and in sort of the broad-based sort of effort to delay and challenge numerous architectures that are existing in the international arena.
Okay, I'm going to skip through just a little bit of stuff here. I don't know if you've noticed, but I am playing it at 1.25, so I hope that helps everyone.
In this context, what I find most fascinating is that we see in space a reflection of some patterns they've taken elsewhere, which is to, again, threaten, as we saw recently by a Russian governmental official, those space capabilities that support Ukraine, threaten that they may be targeted by the Russian government for supporting Ukraine. So utilizing threats against space-based capabilities, and also proudly talk about their laser systems, Earth-based ASAT capabilities, and that at the same time put forward the prevention and placement of weapons in our space treaty, and this amendment and now resolution reflecting prevention of placement of weapons in outer space in a way that seems inconsistent, again, preventing threat or use of force in a manner that seems inconsistent with their activities. And it's a pattern that we've seen, right? They have utilized chemical weapons and are continuing against, as we saw clearly against Navalny and the Skripals, but are continuing to utilize at least riot control agents, and the allegation that was recently made and continued to be investigated about their use of a Schedule 3 chemical weapon in Ukraine, while they purport to support the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it's a challenge that we've been seeing across the board, actions that are inconsistent with the international legal architecture. So it seems like a pattern, and I think we should just be careful to try to prevent their effective disinformation narratives from actually continuing to degrade those international architectures that we need to rely upon for our security and the security of the global community.
We can move to a couple questions from the audience, if that's all right. I have one from Julian Barnes. He's from the New York Times. How close are the Russians to deploying their anti-space weapon, and what would the diplomatic response to such a deployment be?
I don't have an answer for that, for how close they are to deploying. I think the more important question is how we can work to prevent that. And I think everything that we're doing in the diplomatic arena is working to prevent the Russians from going forward with this program. And I think the international response should be outrage if this actually does go forward, because it affects everyone, right? Every single country. It's indiscriminate in its potential effect. So it's much different than efforts to hold us at risk, limited to just the U.S. and our partners and allies. It would affect everyone, including China and India and Russia's own satellites. So it's extraordinarily destabilizing, and I think the international community needs to reflect that concern.
Maybe a follow-on to that. If we are looking at ways to stop Russia from this development, does it make sense to look at a capability like this in terms of a arms control agreement? Does it make sense to approach that a different way? With the Security Council work, that's not necessarily a place where a lot of arms control work happens. Is there a new approach that's really needed here because this is so different, or does it look a lot like a typical arms control effort from the U.S. perspective?
I mean, I think that's a good point to make, is that in the UN Security Council resolution context, we try to, reaffirm and recommit to existing constructs that keep the global community safe. But in our resolution, we proposed, to work towards either politically binding or legally binding mechanisms to further, prevent an arms race in outer space and work towards some credible way to verify these type of commitments. And I think what we need to figure out in implementing the Outer Space Treaty is how we can develop a capability to credibly establish that Russia is no longer pursuing this program. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's not something that I think anything that we can come up with on our own will be lightly agreed to by Russia. And I think you've seen in previous contexts where Syria had denied its chemical weapons program for a long time until basically the U.S. and Russia worked together to bring Syria into the Chemical Weapons Convention and then work to destroy a program that had denied. Historically, we're going to have to think of similar creative ideas to figure out how to credibly believe that Russia is not pursuing this program and how to feel confident that this is not a risk that the world has to continue to focus on.
And I have a question here from Neil Wolfe at McGill University Institute of Air and Space Law, and it relates to that international effort to push back on what Russia's doing. This question is about Japan's participation in the resolution. So the question is, does Japan's participation in the U.S. resolution reflect Japan's existing or possibly growing role in the ISS, particularly in light of Russia's decreasing ISS involvements, or is there another reason that Japan would be interested in this topic?
I mean, Japan has been a very close partner with the United States government in space security, but in the sustainability of outer space. Japan has, I think, deeply supported all of the efforts that the international community has taken to really ensure the long-term sustainability of outer space. And the Japanese space program is clearly doing amazing things to continue to develop and incorporate greater, scientific capacity and improvement of capabilities. And I think Japan was a natural partner, and in fact, really did a really good job in explaining why this should matter to all governments, not just the U.S. and Japan, but all governments that have present or future reliance on outer space. And I think eventually that will be all governments. And so Japan was a natural partner for this, and deeply appreciate their pushing us forward.
And this is kind of a similar question about the impacts. Is there an impact with ISS? But I'll broaden it a bit and talk impacts to just human space activities. And this question is from Charles Liu. He's at the City University of New York. Do you see a direct effect at this time on the International Space Station operations? I'll also add in China's space station, crewed space station, as well as international scientific operations in low Earth orbit or beyond, space telescope missions or space exploration missions. So what is is there a broader impact to these type of activities that are really not national security focused, definitely focused on that crewed aspect, the human aspect? How does this relate to those activities?
Right. So as I mentioned, this capability is not presently in orbit. However, I think the concern is that it would potentially impact all of the scientific, commercial, communications, agriculture, again, meteorological, all of the capacities in space could potentially be impacted on by such a program if it goes forward to actual placement in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And, those are impacts that would depend on the magnitude and the location, but that's something that we should all be concerned about.
And that's another question along this thread. This is from Joshua Keating from Vox. How would something like this activity, how would this impact cooperation, what there is left post-Ukraine, between NASA and Roscosmos on ISS or other work? Does it have the potential to really impact what is left of that space cooperation in the civil domain?
Listen, I think it's important that we continue as much cooperation as possible. But I do think, working toward a situation in which we can credibly confirm nothing is going forward that would violate the Outer Space Treaty would be important. But having alerted the international community to this concern, having taken it seriously and addressed it in a UN Security Council resolution, we will continue to push Russia to work with us on this. But I don't think that the fact that we're working towards credibly confirming that this is not a program that will continue should necessarily require no cooperation whatsoever. So as you point out, it's very limited right now. But I don't think that the existing capacity to cooperate should necessarily be diminished even further while we try to figure out how Russia credibly demonstrates that is not pursuing this capability.
Okay, sorry. About the little lull there. Let's continue.
And we've talked, had a few questions here about the International Space Station, civil efforts in space exploration. One thing I also was wondering your thoughts on, how does a capability like this, how does this maybe cause us to rethink our space architectures? Talking a lot about proliferated constellations and low Earth orbit. Looking at this, is this a way to put those at risk in your mind, or is this a different goal if Russia's trying to deploy this capability? I know we might not know, but just looking for how the U.S. government looks at why Russia would be doing this, and does this mean that we should rethink how we are looking at our space architectures?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. There's a lot of things that Russia seems to be doing to potentially have leverage or to hold U.S. government capacities at risk. But in this context, I would definitely refer you to the Department of Defense and to Space Force and Space Command for how we can sort of more effectively respond or address. I think we're doing a lot already to address some of the challenges we have in space when you talk about sort of these really diversified, responsive architectures. I think there are already efforts we're taking to address some of the space challenges, but certainly with respect to how we change or how we evolve or even what we do to be more responsive and to defend against this, I would refer you to the Department of Defense.
Maybe we'll do one more question from the audience here and then start to wrap up.
Okay.
This is from Ramin Skiba at Popular Mechanics. As an effort in transparency and to nudge Russia to provide more information about this potential weapon, is the U.S. prepared to release more information about its own developing counter space capabilities?
It's an interesting question because it assumes capacities that may or may not exist, but certainly the U.S. has tried to be as transparent as possible with regard to space programs, explaining even in the face of narratives that certain of our capacities are weaponized when they're not. So I would refer you to some of the really good communications about what we're doing in space, the clarification and the transparency that's being provided both by the Space Force and by Space Command and our Department of Defense colleagues, because I think they have tried to address some of the allegations and trying to demonstrate what actually we're doing in space. Again, I think there are others that can answer that question better than I can, but I would say, I'm thinking historically back when some of our extraordinarily NASA-related peaceful scientific efforts were accused of being weapons. We are subjected to allegations all the time, and we try to be as transparent as possible as to the purpose of our programs.
Maybe as a question to end on, just looking forward, you could see two paths. This is something that Russia develops and deploys its capability. Are there concerns that China could want one next, or this could be a capability that would be proliferating in orbit, more than just Russia wanting this capability? So that's one vision. And I guess the question would be, how could we stop that? What are the next steps really that the U.S. is looking for? Is that happening at the UN? Is that happening behind the scenes? Is it a combination of that? Realizing that there's probably no silver bullet, how do you think a scenario like that could happen? And then, what is in your mind the best way that the U.S. should be trying to prevent that?
Yeah, I'll use the opportunity to again refer to the Space Threat Assessment Report talking about normalizing deviance, and that we've seen development in sort of capacities to jam or to dazzle or to blind. I mean, the fact that Russia has been bragging about its laser capabilities is normalizing the sort of that capacity. We've heard allegations of GPS jamming around Kaliningrad that could potentially impact airlines and the safety of air travel, and so these kind of things should not be normalized. But you're right to point out that if we don't prevent them, try to demonstrate them as deviant from what is the responsible approach, what is consistent with international law, we risk other governments, potentially following that path. We've seen this in numerous arenas in the arms control context, right? Just if we think about chemical weapons and how Syria's repeated use of chemical weapons has led to, greater potential use by non-state actors and continuing use by other governments in ways that demonstrates less and less upholding of the norm. So it's a context in which arms control often has to operate to redefine and reestablish the importance of international law to prevent, both irresponsible actors, but also illegal activity inconsistent with existing guidelines. So I think the concern is always that if this is allowed to proceed and become something that gives Russia any sort of advantage, it's harder to prevent other governments from doing the same. And I think, international law stands, hopefully, as that reminder of something that we've all collectively negotiated because it's in our collective interest. Russia, the US, China, everyone's interest to prevent these type of destabilizing capacities. And so that's why we've been working very hard to figure out how we can continue to enforce and uphold and support the Outer Space Treaty and work towards preventing this arms race in outer space by additional mechanisms.
Yeah, that's a great way to end this. Just that the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, a lot of the same motivators back then drive us today, and looking for that safe, stable, sustainable, peaceful space environment is really the same goal. And it sounds like it underpins a lot of your efforts today and how you're approaching this.
Absolutely.
Well, we're at time. I want to thank you, Secretary Stewart, for joining us today. Thank you for your support of CSIS generally, particularly your work with the Project on Nuclear Issues led by Heather Williams. Thank you to everyone who joined today in person and online. And with that, have a good weekend, and may the 4th be with you.
All right, just to wrap up, I think that this is a very critical issue, and they stated that there needs to be more awareness regarding this issue, so I feel very comfortable providing this information, and if you can spread the word, I would appreciate it. And then I would also appreciate, as a personal favor, if you would like, subscribe, and even comment and share. Thank you so much. Can't find the pause button.